All right, good morning, everyone. Maria Gonzalez here from Vida del Norte, doing a regular coffee and conversation this morning. I just wanted to talk a little bit this morning about trauma. I'm running out of guest speakers, so if anyone would like to come on and talk, if you have maybe something happening in the community that you'd like to speak about, we're welcoming guest speakers. I've been kind of struggling getting some people on, and so I'm trying to be a little bit creative on some things to talk about. But so this morning I thought it would be relevant to talk about trauma. I have been reading a book called My Grandmother's Hands, and it is a part of the book club series that Yoga Sala and Gaya McGee are doing. In fact, a book club, we're meeting this evening from 4:30 to 5:15. So if you're interested in being part of the book club and reading a book once a month and then coming together and talking about it, go to the Yoga Sala website and look at the schedule of events that they have. They actually have a lot of other things going on right now. They've got some virtual hip hop classes for our youth, and I think Qigong, yoga. There's a sewing workshop that Miss Valerie Vihil is going to be doing virtually. So we got some things going on in our community as we get ready to start opening back up and get back into some regular routines here. So, but anyways, this book has been really interesting to me because it talks a lot about trauma. Trauma's, something, and not just trauma in the sense of like trauma happened to me, but talking about historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and it puts it in the context of black black lives, white supremacy or white privilege, and police uh, privilege. And the way it's talking about, because all of these things are really relevant in our country right now. We're seeing it happen. We're seeing the racism. We're seeing how people are responding to each other in these types of situations, and it's coming from a place where we all need to learn how to heal. We all need to learn how to heal within ourselves before we can actually move forward. But it also comes back to a lot of like the ancestral trauma that we deal with. I've been really interested in this subject for probably since I started looking at my own trauma and realizing that that maybe not all of my trauma was my trauma, but I've learned how to get rid of some of that ancestral trauma, so to speak. One of the things that he talks about is metabolizing our trauma and letting it go. So I just want to kind of talk about that a little bit because to me, that was probably one of the most important takeaways that I took away from reading this book. It's because we think about when you think about metabolize, you automatically think about body and weight loss and how your body is able to get rid of the toxins that we put in on a daily basis. We don't ever think about the mind. We don't think about what goes in here and what we feel right here, because I think we're programmed to be more physical beings than we are to be spiritual or mental beings. I don't know. That's just kind of how I feel society has programmed us to be and to become. So talking about like this metabolism, and that's probably all I'm going to talk about, because this book goes into depth of several different types of, I guess, uh, I don't know how to explain it, but it's this ingrained DNA trauma that we all seem to carry. And that's what this book talks about. But I want to just talk about metabolizing the trauma because to me, that was a really important piece. So I'm going to just talk from a from personal experience, and I'm not going to talk from a professional standpoint, because that's not really where I wanted to go with this. But personally, when I was thinking and going through some of these exercises in this book and thinking about metabolizing trauma, I was like, well, how do we metabolize trauma and how do we get rid of it? Well, I'm going to talk about an experience that I had, and this is something that I talk about quite a bit, because it doesn't sit with me anymore, and I'm not going to cry on you guys. But as a young woman, as a young lady, I was sexually abused, and I never had the I guess the skills or the strength, so to speak, to talk about what was going on with me. And this is something that happened to me for a period of 4 years, and I never did tell anyone, and it really did affect me deeply. I not being able to share that secret with anyone in my family or anyone in my immediate circle was really difficult. So I held on to the secret for, let me see, 8, 9, almost 10 years before before I was able to finally talk about it. And in the meantime, I was carrying all of this trauma with me, and it really led to some really risky behaviors and some things that were not very good for my health, my well-being, and probably not for those who were around me either, because I started drinking, I started doing drugs. I was involved with a lot of sexual relations at the time, and granted, I was a teenager, and it was just really, really not a good place for me to be in. Not realizing, because I hadn't been prepared with the coping skills or the life skills that I needed to be able to come forth and talk about these types of things. I really just, that was my way of coping, is drugging, drinking, and sexing. So I did that for a while, and then the moment that I realized what had happened to me, and I think this might happen for some other sexual assault victims as well. Like, the moment I realized something had happened to me was I was sitting in a college class. I can't remember the name of the class exactly, but it was a psychology class. And I was reading through the book, and there was a passage, and it was talking about trauma and rape victims. And I didn't break down in class, but I felt this gut wrenching, ugly feeling in my body. And when I finished with class, I went on. I used to go to the library and do homework. And that day, I remember driving off in my car and just kind of. I think I landed up at the gorge bridge over at the Junction Bridge over by Clower campus, because that's where I was going to school. And I remember getting out of my car, looking at the water and going, what the heck just happened to me? Because it was almost like I was having to, like I relived the moments of my abuse in a split second. So I didn't realize really, like, what was what was what was going on with my body, but I remember the feeling, I remember the reaction, and I remember that it was sickening, and I didn't want to feel like that. It just so happened that I was pregnant at the time when this happened, and so I had a doctor's appointment, one of my first or second doctor's appointment, and no one had ever asked me if I had ever been sexually assaulted until this appointment. And of course, Jason was with me in that time, and I didn't want to say anything because he didn't know what had happened to me either. So my next appointment, next doctor's appointment visit, I did, and I went alone, and I did tell the doctor and the midwife that was with me that yes, I had been sexually assaulted, and then it went from there. I started getting therapeutic support. I went to a therapist that I wasn't very comfortable with, so I didn't continue with that. But I did learn, I did start reading, and I did start practicing what I needed to be able to get that out. It wasn't easy. It was one of the hardest times in my life, one of the hardest times in, especially being a pregnant woman and having to go through all of these emotions when, when you're getting ready to have a child was not easy at all. But I learned how to cope with it. And I did a whole bunch of things. I went to church. I, would go out into the woods and I'd scream. I'd go fishing. I got really close to my dad, who was someone who I hadn't been that close to in that moment in time in my life, and it was really a good bonding experience for us because I needed him there while I went through it. He still didn't know what was happening with me. The only one that knew at this point was Jason and my mom. But I got through it, and I moved through it all pretty much on my own. I didn't seek therapeutic support because, like I said, I wasn't comfortable with the therapist that I was going to, and but I did learn how to cope and how to deal because of the literature that I was reading. Probably the classes that I was taking in school helped out as well. But I just wanted to kind of share that little story with you because it took years. It took years of healing to get to a place where I felt like I had finally metabolized. And I say this word because I love the way he talked about metabolizing our trauma. And so it took some years for me to get to that place. And I remember the exact moment when it happened. I had already come full circle with my perpetrator. I was able to talk to him about what he had done to me, and we hashed it out. And I did forgive, but I wasn't fully in full forgiveness of being able to say I completely and fully forgive you. And that didn't come till let me see, probably about 4, maybe even 6 years later. And it wasn't until this moment of it was kind of like a retribution that happened, where I was finally able to tell this person, you know what, I fully and completely forgive you, and I no longer you no longer carry me with you, and I no longer carry you with me. And it was a really enlightening moment at that time when I was finally able to say, I no longer carry you as my burden, and I no longer you no longer need to carry me as a burden as well, because I fully was able to fully forgive that person. And that was one of those moments where I think healing really occurred in my path from trauma and being able to metabolize that trauma. So I guess one of the things that I'd like to ask for people who may be watching, or anybody who may be dealing with things. I know, like when we're talking in the addiction world, we're looking at the right here, right now, because we want to try to get people sober. But when people go into sobriety, I think one of the hardest things for them, and this is my own opinion, this is just something, a conclusion that I've drawn, and what I think. I feel like people who maybe go into recovery, they don't know how to deal with the trauma that has either come from the recovery, or the trauma that happened before they went, or I mean, the trauma that has happened from the addiction, or they don't know how to work with the trauma that happened prior to the addiction. And I think that seems to be a place where people tend to get stuck, and it does end up causing those relapses. And I was thinking about this throughout this whole book of, I've talked about this, we've talked about this in Coffee and Conversation in the last couple of weeks, of how we're constantly recovering. I feel like we're always in a recovery mode, no matter whether it's addiction that we're dealing with, whether it's trauma that we're dealing with. We're constantly in this recovery mode. We're always having to recover from something. What grief is something that, it's so hard. Grief, we're always grief stricken. I always used to wonder why people were always, talking about their loved ones, or posting about them on social media. And I really didn't understand it until I went through it. And when I lost my dad, it took a lot of strength to move forward and and get through losing him. I'm still not over it. I still struggle with the grief of losing him, and it's never easy. um but I think, those are those trauma responses that we have, where we every human has that. Every human experiences some kind of loss and some kind of trauma throughout their life. And I mean, and it can be any kind of trauma. It can be job loss, it could be loss of a person, loss of a pet. We a lot of times, when our kids, when our kids have kittens or dogs, and we land up losing those pets, it's a big loss for them. And we don't take the time to look at what that experience is for that person, and acknowledge that it's happening, and help them work through it. So I'm asking that we all start looking at what are our traumas, what are we holding on to that we haven't been able to let go of, and what can we do to start releasing this energy and start healing ourselves. If we don't heal ourselves, then we're not going to be any good for anybody else. So I hope that this made sense. And if it didn't, please ask questions. And uh, I've intended these Coffee and Conversations to be a conversation. So if anything that I said made sense and a light bulb went off, and you're like, you know what? Maybe I do need to start looking at this trauma. Maybe I do need to start looking at healing myself, and looking at my mental perception. But also think about, like, what else has happened. Like, I mean, do we have family traumas, historical traumas that may have happened throughout the generations? Something that kind of popped up the other day. Jason was like, I don't know what he was reading, and he said, can you imagine 400 years of slavery? Like, and he's like, can you imagine what that does to a person? He's like, that's like 100 grandmas living consecutively. That's four grandmas. We lost Grandma Lucy at 101. That's four of her lifetimes, one right after another. And he said, can you imagine what that does to a person? And that's what this book talks about. It talks about that historical trauma. So it becomes this circular type of process where people just continue to get traumatized, and then it just becomes this normal thing. But what we're not realizing is that we're holding all of that traumatic DNA within ourselves, and it gets passed on from generation to generation. So we really do need to start looking at our trauma, and not just our trauma as we do it as people, because that's how we're going to start to really heal. Once we heal ourselves, then we could start to heal the world. But the thing is that we also have to start looking at the trauma as from a cultural perspective, and start looking at what are the traumas we have caused, culturally, and then what are some traumas that have been caused to us culturally. And we really need to start looking at that before we can start healing. Anyways, that is what I have to say for today. I hope that this made sense. And if it doesn't, then scroll on by and don't listen. Anyways, I hope to have maybe some youth on Friday to talk a little bit about some things that they're anticipating that will be coming up in the next couple months. And I hope that you all have a very good day and a good rest of your week. And like I said, the book club is happening this evening. Like I said, this book came from this book club. I would have never read it, and I'm so grateful that I did, because it really did put a lot of things into perspective for me. And I think everybody should read it, because it's really great. It's a really great book, and the way it talks about the intergenerational and the historical trauma is really important. So again, that book is called My Grandmother's Hands, and I'll see you all back here on Friday. Thank you.